we've got some time, if you have the time and patience, for some questions and answers discussion. So feel free to answer from Paul.
Thank you very much for this very interesting expose. Mr. Eyal, you referred to the influence or the presence of Russian oligarchs or Jewish oligarchs for the contacts with Israel. How important is the presence of these oligarchs in the society and the economy of Israel?
It is increasingly important. For instance, one of the owners of Haaretz newspaper, which is probably Israel's most prestigious newspaper, it seems to be the Israeli New York Times. It's owned by Mr. Leonard Nevling, partly owned by the Shokin family. Still owns the majority vote, but let's say that he's a very strategic investor there. Without him, probably Haaretz would have crumbled. So that's one example. My own newspaper, former newspaper, I should say, Maariv, was owned by Mr. Gusinski, partly owned by Mr. Gusinski. There are publications that the whole real estate bubble in Tel Aviv, the whole real estate bubble in Tel Aviv, all of it, can be attributed to money coming from Russia, not only from oligarchs, also from very rich Russians, which are not oligarchs. They don't all need to be billionaires. It's enough if they have a few dozen millions of dollars and they want to buy a flat in one of Tel Aviv's nice boulevards, which, as you all know, are very nice and very expensive now. We've seen certain people aspiring to buy communication and media organizations in this country, which are also from Russian descent. Not all of them, I should say, are Jewish oligarchs. Some of them are Jewish oligarchs. So we also have been seeing an interest by people who are not necessarily Jewish. And how do you say, Mr. Dr. Khanin would say that better. Let's say that every Russian that wants a Jewish ancestry might find one, if he looks carefully enough. And many Russians do want it.
Something personal?
No, absolutely not. I am of Russian descent myself, on both sides. So no, but I'm speaking about the newly conceived Jewish roots, which are maturing mainly with billionaires that suddenly are finding their connection to Judaism. So you see a growing impact. And you see it all across Europe, I should say. And of course, countries are looking for these investors. And we've seen the way that the UK, for instance, is treating Russian money, probably opening up everything, not considering all kinds of difficult regulations, in order for that money simply to be invested. And Israel has been doing that for a few years, not for many years. There is a change of strategy last 5 years, which means doors are open for any capital coming from Russia here, and it's benefiting, I think, the Israeli economy.
Could I disagree with you?
This is a university.
That's university. Well, I would say, I'll make the long story short. I'm much less enthusiastic about the presence of Russian oligarchs here. In fact, they're permitted to enter the marginal spheres of the local society and economy. Okay, people don't mind. They invest money into newspapers or some media assets. They, of course, welcome to give their money to the universities, to the hospitals, to the museums, and so on and so forth, but they're not permitted to buy really the assets of national strategic meaning. That's for sure. So these people actually came and checked the situation and understood that it's better to invest their money outside. That is why Mr. Nevlin's major activity, he gives a lot of money to the Beit Hatfutzot, the Museum of Jewish Diasporas, but his major economic activities in the United States. And Mr. Gusinski, who is mentioned here, is conducting his empire from the Gibraltar and not from Tel Aviv. And this Ukrainian guy who wanted to join the company with Nochi Dankner and became an owner of this big IDB super concern was not permitted to do so because of different reasons. I'm not talking about that. So I would say that if we are expecting that big Russian money will come here, it is not happening like at the moment.
Ambassador from Holland, Netherlands.
Yeah, I'm from Holland. I feel leapfrog today. Rather leapfrog by democracies than by dictatorships. I think it makes a difference. I have one more general question, one more specific question. I told Professor Steinberg to distribute those to the panel. My more general question is that I believe that the power of autocracies is often overestimated, and the power of democracies is often underestimated, also by democracies themselves. And to what extent do you believe that the Kremlin also fears its own people more than anything else? To what extent may this have been a factor in Putin's calculations over the past few weeks that the Kremlin would want to prevent Maidan-like events happening on the Red Square? Does that also play a role? My more specific question is that if the current stalemate continues between at one side the US and the EU and the other side the Russian Federation, to what extent do you believe that this can undermine the unity in the P5+1, E3+3 regarding Iran? Now, I'm personally not very optimistic regarding the outcome of the negotiations, but at least we had a huge advantage over the past few months and years that there was unity of the US, the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese vis-a-vis Iran. Could that be undermined by what's happening in the international scene right now, and what would be the consequences?
Well, who wants to go first? Very complex questions.
I'll go for the P5+1.
Okay, I'll go for the P5+1, and I'll leave the more complex and in-depth question for people which are more complex than the journalists. The P5+1, if your question is the confrontation between the West and Russia and maybe China in relation to Syria, might it spread and contaminate the P5+1 discussions with Iran? I don't think so. I think that the P5+1, and you see that with the whole, I would say, failure of the Israeli decision makers vis-a-vis the ship that was caught carrying arms, Iranian-based arms to the Gaza Strip. The Israeli decision makers trying to make the case that Iran is fooling the world, and what basically the US has been saying is, we know that this is a terror-sponsored state, but we want to get an agreement with them on their nuclear program. That was basically what the White House has been saying. And that's the same thing about the P5+1 in relation to to the Iranian issue. Whether or not this accord would ultimately fail, and I know that there's a lot of pessimism in the EU, and there's a lot of pessimism in Washington in relation to the outcome, to an agreement, to a final agreement, I don't think that it has much to do with Syria. They will do whatever they can to get an agreement in relation to the Iranian program. For what I hear, the Russians themselves do not want a heavy water reactor based in Iran. The Americans have already forfeited their main card, which is the agreement to enrich. I was there in the Saban Forum when President Obama first said, I have no problem with enrichment, with the idea of enrichment within Iran. And the whole question now lays with security checks and balances, inspection, and the heavy water reactor. The attempt by Israel to bring in ballistic missile planning, weapon group inspection, an element of an Iranian admission of what they did. This, for now, has failed vis-a-vis Washington. The whole thing rests now on the heavy water reactor, right now. Now, if the Russians stay firm, This will ultimately should bring the Iranians to agree to that, or not to agree. But it will not break the P5+1, as far as we are hearing from the Russians. Now, if the Russians are going to change course and say, no, we want a heavy water plutonium reactor operating in Iran, you know, you can never expect what they would do. It would probably make the Americans very, very angry. That's the point for them to do that, because you know the whole policy is sometimes based on that. But I don't believe that's not a serious issue.
I will answer the same question, but I will speak as an economist. Well, you have explained a lot of data about what is happening, but my point of view, and this is my belief, it's the economics stupid, as Kim said, meaning that the economy of the US is not growing, the economy of the EU is not growing. They look at Iran and they say, we want to open trade with Iran and also FDIs on both sides. Period. We will define as it is. They will already find a way. This is the economy speaking. And of course, Russia has exactly, from the point of view of economics, the same reason to say yes. So the way they will determine if it is kosher or not, what is the agreement, we saw how much you can define it in one way or the other. Of course, for the Israelis, we look at it completely different, but we are not the leader and we are not an hegemony.
I will just add to that. Oh, go ahead, Ze'ev. On the issue of on the nuclear proliferation issue in Iran, certainly what I've heard from almost every Russian official and analyst that I've spoken to, at least for a decade, is we can live with a certain amount of Iranian enrichment and even close to having nuclear capability, but a large-scale capability, making Iran a real nuclear power, meaning having the ability to use the reactor to produce plutonium, that's a whole different aspect. And the Russians have been pretty consistent about that. However, I do think that if we look at the history of the sanctions process, and this is what the Prime Minister and Israelis were very concerned about, it was to a very difficult struggle to get both Russia and China to agree to enough sanctions against Iran, economic sanctions, so that we reached the case, in the consensus view, that a year ago the Iranian economy was suffering enough and politically the costs were high enough that they had to at least come to terms. Israelis were hoping for better terms. If the P5+1 fails in the next, whatever's left, 5 months, and the United States then, whether for congressional reasons or with the role of the administration as a partner in this, goes back to trying to restore the sanction regime, there'll be issues with Europe, but there may be much stronger economic reasons with getting Russia back on board. So I think there is a potential there for friction.
I would say that the answer to your second question concerning Iran is very much relates to the answer to your first question. What are the sources of strength of the contemporary ruling elite and Mr. Putin in particular? In fact, we have to take into account that the process of the creation of the Russian ethnic and civic nation was stopped in about 100 years ago with the Bolshevik Revolution. I myself had from many of Russian public figures and experts a couple of months ago, a so-called Valdai Forum, the presidential conference, which happens in Moscow, that all the attempts to reinvent this process after 1991 at the moment have failed. Meaning that they have no choice, that's what Russians say by themselves, but in order to preserve their unity, to strengthen the imperial idea. And if they are empire, they have to be everywhere where the empire should be, including first of all in the Middle East. You know, this, if you call to the God's office from here, that's a local call. So from this point of view, Russia is asking to restore this gentleman agreement which Mr. Gorbachev and Yeltsin had with the West. That means the former Soviet republics, except 3 Baltic states, should be the sphere of ultimate interest of the Russian Federation. And as far as we can see, that this gentleman agreement is fair, I mean, nobody is going on with that. Moscow is interested to have more cards on the table. Iran and Syria are among these cards, and Ukraine, by the way. If from the European capitals and from Washington, they will see better or more complement messengers, they would probably be ready to be positive also in the other fields. But meantime, it's not going on.
Last question, I think, before they throw us out of here.
My question is for Professor Brezis. You said that migration in part of a population in Western Europe, migration is not the solution because of the low human capital. If we study the migration patterns in history, not all migrants are PhDs, I think. For example, there's a country, for example, Australia, they have a very good migration policy. But one of their criteria is to have the people who would come are taught to integrate with the society. But they were founded from a country who were convicts, but they built a great nation. And now there are more Greeks in Melbourne than in Athens. So if the United States, if you take a look at the migrating patterns, Germans, Italians, they were not highly educated. They were able to blend with the majority. And I'm not sure if that was tested, but I think there might be other criteria, subliminal messages to other countries that they're probably not welcome in the migration of these countries. Thank you.
I knew that if I write this sentence, this will be the one to be caught when this was really the minor point. But I put it because there is some new research about. Okay, first, migration has been during all the centuries extremely important, exactly as you have shown. Australia wouldn't exist without, in Israel wouldn't exist without, for sure. The question now is the question that very developed countries ask about migration of population coming from less developed countries. And what you get is that during the first, until the 80s, those migrants were entering the very low skilled. And from this point of view, it was important because this is what was needed in those developed countries. And some of their children have entered higher human capital, but not from all the countries. This is what the data show. Now, today, when you need less low skilled, then you have a problem that it takes time. And usually the system in those countries is such that human capital doesn't grow as rapidly as it was in the beginning of the 20th century.
Maybe a topic for another forum.
Yes.
Israeli experience.
But you just picked really the point, the problematic point.
I want to thank everybody. Certainly, I want to thank our speakers, Nadav Eyal, for coming at the last minute and very brilliantly presenting a lot of the dilemmas. Professor Khanin, Professor Brezis, also the Bar-Ilan staff that put this together, Ruth Cohen and the others, Vice President Judah Kleimov. It's always a pleasure to see all of you, and we look forward in the next couple of months to doing another ambassador forum, so thank you for joining us.